Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live webinar today on equipment records and calibration requirements. This is our first episode in our ISO IEC 17025 Nonconformance series. Everyone at Qualtrics and A2LA Workplace Training are very excited to kick off this series with you all and put forward some very educational information. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Number one, this will be recorded and archived. I know we're already getting a lot of questions about that. So this will be available for you to see. It'll be available on our website, but even because you've registered to attend this webinar, you'll also receive a recording once it is available. We'll also have the slides that we go through and Tim goes through available as well. Also, in this session, we will have a question and answer session towards the end. So if you have questions and you want to ask Tim or Qualtrics, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section located in the Zoom webinar application. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll go through those and answer as many as we possibly can within the hour. So my name is Karen Arriviaga, and I'm an account executive here at Qualtrics. We have a mix of attendees joining us today. So before we get to the main event, I do want to give you a quick overview of our company. Qualtrics is a compliance software platform specifically designed to manage quality initiatives. Organizations will turn to Qualtrics when they're looking to reduce or eliminate the burden associated with manual or paper-based systems. And they do this by automating key processes. Qualtrics was founded back in 1993 when our parent company was pursuing ISO 9001. They were looking for a way to streamline the process and ensure that no details were overlooked. So they started from scratch and built a framework that would ultimately become Qualtrics. Not only did they crush their audit, but the assessors were so impressed with the software that they suggested we start selling it. So we did. Today, more than 25 years later, we are a leader in the quality and compliance industry, and we're happy to count several accrediting bodies among our customers, including today's presenter, A2LA. So now, without further ado, let me introduce Tim Osborne. So Tim serves as the Vice President of A2LA Workplace Training, which is a training and consulting company. Now, previously, as the Director of Quality for Tresco Inc., he provided private and public training on management systems, quality control, and metrology. Through NCSLI, he served as a technical expert to the ISO Working Group 44, which was responsible for revising ISO IEC 17025 2017. In addition, he participated in and oversaw the development of the ANSI NCSL Z540.3 handbook, that's a mouthful, and several of the NCSLI recommended practices and taught several tutorials. Tim has a bachelor's degree in nuclear engineering with an emphasis in materials engineering and chemistry. So Tim, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite you to join me and take control.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and first and foremost, thanks Qualtrics for hosting this webinar and allowing me to come in and share a little bit of insight that A2LA has on this. So again, thanks Qualtrics. So without much further ado, let's get started with this conformance series. The first, as you can see from the screen, we're going to focus our attention
Tim,
on...
I actually don't see your screen yet.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
What's going on? That's weird. Did it launch? For some reason or other, it kicked me out of the meeting on my laptop.
Oh.
Interesting. Let me see if I can escape out of this and come back into it.
No problem. We will be patient. As much as we practice these things, some of this stuff happens. So while we wait, we can just hang out for a little bit, and hopefully your system will come up soon. Thank you, everybody, for your patience.
Yeah, I apologize for this.
Oh, no worries.
is it doing that? Yeah, it's forcing me to completely go in and redo the whole thing.
Well, while Tim is doing that, here, what I'll do is just try. Are you completely out of the system, Tim?
Yeah, I'm trying to log back in. Why don't you start your part of the presentation and I'll come back in.
All right, so everybody, we'll do this a little bit backwards, but I'll go ahead and kick off what we were going to talk about Qualtrics, and hopefully by the time I'm done, and it won't take too long, we'll go ahead and have Tim back with us. So this might seem a little backwards, but I think at the end of the day, you'll still get a lot of really great information about this. So pretty much what Tim's going to review with you in terms of equipment records and calibration requirements, at Qualtrics, we actually get a lot of questions about how you maintain or how you can use Qualtrics to show conformance to these parts of the standard. And it really comes down to, as you're creating your SOPs for ISO IEC 17025, the big question is, you might have that document or that SOP, but how are you going to show conformance to the maintenance plans that you have developed? And what we've learned from our side is that through our customers and accrediting body partners like A2LA, the labs themselves find that they could have nonconformities when they're unable to demonstrate conformance to those plans. And so what I'm going to do is take you into Qualtrics and just show you how some of our customers are using it today to prove conformance to ISO IEC 17025. So let me pull up a system. When you first log into Qualtrics, you're going to come to an inbox, which is your home page, to access the different processes you would like to manage in the system. In Tim's presentation, he points to the need to verify that your equipment conforms to specified requirements, and that validating your equipment before it's put into service is also necessary. You'll see that when Tim shows his part of the presentation. In Qualtrics, organizations would use workflows to help demonstrate conformity to these processes. I'm going to come over here and click the workflow section of our product. Workflows are ways to automate processes where each step is defined with customizable fields and then routed with automatic email alerts and notifications, really keeping tasks on time and holding employees accountable. The first workflow that we're going to review is an example workflow that some of our customers have built to help them manage their equipment maintenance and calibration records. And it's actually called our equipment maintenance workflow. So when you open the equipment maintenance workflow, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and you'll look at a diagram that walks you through each step. And you're like, well, this doesn't seem like it's a lot of steps. And actually, it's not. It's relatively a pretty straightforward workflow. But by automating a process like this, what Qualtrics is going to do, it's going to hold all of your equipment records in one location. It's also going to alert you when the maintenance needs to occur, therefore holding you and your team in conformance to your own equipment maintenance procedures. So what do these steps include? Includes just initially logging your equipment, having a list of all the equipment that you have in your organization, in your laboratory, so you can make sure that it's being tracked. Then the second one is going to be around equipment maintenance, making sure you're tracking all the information around the calibration and maintenance portions of it. And then when it's all said and done, those will be completed, and an alert will be available to alert you when the next time one of these needs to go and be done. So what I'm going to do is go through the first step of this process, which only needs to happen once. It's when you're logging a piece of equipment into this workflow for the first time. So I'm going to choose an LCMS. And for anybody that's joining late, Tim Osborne is on a call, and he's going to be showing his presentation. We ran into a little bit of a difficulty, but we'll be rearranging our presentation, but he will be presenting here shortly. So here's the LCMS. I'm going to choose a manufacturer, and then I'm also going to put in the model number, and then even a serial number. So you are logging all the information specifically about this piece of equipment, where it's located, if a calibration is required. Now, since this is the first time I've logged this information, I don't have any calibration data or legacy calibration data in here. So I know that the last day of calibration for this piece of equipment was last November on the 18th. And I know the next period that this needs to be calibrated, or the next date, we'll say it's a 6-month period. We're going to say that it's going to be May 18th of 2020. So now that I have this initial information in here, I can hit initiate, and now that equipment is logged in my equipment list. At this point, it's going to take me to the next step of the process, where I'm going to then fill in details about the calibration and the maintenance that has occurred. If I go up here to the top, we see this, we're adding another date here. This is a very critical date. This date is actually going to be sending or triggering an email notification and an inbox notification out when I would like to be notified that this next maintenance or next calibration is approaching. So if I know that the next calibration is May 18th, 2020, I can come here and say that I want to be notified in April. The beginning of April, we'll say the 6th of April. I want an email notification and an inbox notification in Qualtrics telling me that equipment maintenance of some sort needs to happen at 5/18/2020, in this case, a calibration. As I scroll down, I also have information in this workflow to actually log equipment and calibration details. So if having that calibration record from November 18th, I can look at that and actually complete some of this information. What type of maintenance it was. You can see I have multiple options on top of calibration. The date that it was performed. So in this case, we know that it happened on the 18th of November. What was the expected results? We'll say the expected results were 3.14159, and the actual results were 3.14111. It's within range, yes. And do I want to add any associated documentation? This is a great opportunity to be able to actually bring in the calibration log for the piece of equipment that you have and bring in that specific document and record and attach it to this instance. And so by doing that, everything's in one location. When your auditor comes in, you'll be actually able to show your records from Qualtrics. And then I'll even be able to tell them, okay, this is who I am. I'm the quality assurance manager. So everyone specifically knows who did what step of this process. The other areas of this workflow include whether or not a piece of equipment is out of service. So if it is out of service, you would say yes. In this case, it is not. But if it is out of service, you would then say when it was taken out of service. And then the last is actually showing just a general maintenance comments in terms of, in this case, calibration report results were within range, equipment was successfully calibrated. At this point, I am done recording the information I need in Qualtrics for this specific instance. If I click calibration maintenance complete, at this point, this is going to go away, and it's only going to resurface and come back into my inbox when that notification date hits. So in April 6th of 2020, then I'm going to receive that notification in inbox, reminding me that it's time to go back into that piece of equipment and do what I need to do to schedule that calibration. Now, what I went ahead and did was I set a calibration for me to be notified about a maintenance instance for my GCMS. And so you can see I have it in my inbox. By having it in my inbox, this is my view of what I need to complete within our system. These dots that you see next to these tasks are going to follow this legend up here. So when it's green, it's newly added, approaching its due date, late, or expedited if it gets to red. All of these different levels are also going to be paired with email notifications. So as things proceed and people forget or ignore them in their system, automatic email notifications will continue to be sent by Qualtrics until somebody completes that task. So in this case, I would click my GCMS, come in, be able to see all the information about my first calibration, when I need to redo my next one. So if again, 6-month period, I could come in here and say I want to be alerted in June of next year. I would come down, see the original calibration, but then even be able to add another calibration or maintenance for here. So I could choose, this is going to be another calibration. This one is going to occur in January of next year. Here's my expected results once that occurs, and so on and so on. And so I'm clearly capturing that information throughout this webinar, throughout this process. Now, having it all in one location is where we start talking about some of the benefits. So for example, if I go to my reports section of Qualtrics, I'm going to see that I have a couple of reports that are standard in our system, but then I also have the ability to create some other reports that are very specific to some of the processes I have in here as well. So here, equipment maintenance is one that I'll run, and it'll give you all of the list of your equipment, who the manufacturer is, the last time it was calibrated, and so on and so on and so on. So at any point, when you have an auditor that's with you and they want to see your calibration and maintenance records, you can quickly come to this list, pull up a record, and be able to see all of the details associated with that record in terms of the calibration and the associated documentation, and all of that will be available and easy to find. So let's jump into another workflow real fast. Another process that Tim's going to point out in his presentation is around validation and validating your equipment. With our workflows, we have a number of best-in-class workflows that automatically come with our system for you to use. One of those is specifically around validating your equipment. So let's go ahead and click that one. Again, when you open this workflow and you scroll to the bottom, you're going to see a lot of the details associated with this process. By automating this process like this, you are controlling every equipment validation to be performed the same exact way each time, and making sure that you're collecting all the information that you need to and having the proper approvals throughout that process. So let's go through the fields. The first field is initiating that validation. So if I come up here to the top, I would choose a section of the organization, choose a specific piece of equipment that I want to have validated. So in this case, we'll see it's a LCMS, and choose a responsible person to actually perform the validation plan and the actual validation process. You get to choose who's going to be listed in this list. A lot of times those people have to be trained and have to show competencies to this type of training, or just to be able to perform these validations. And so you could choose specifically who's going to be in this system or in this list. I'm going to choose Trevor Adams just because I happen to be Trevor Adams logged into this system. And when I choose him and hit plan initiated, what happens with Qualtrics when it goes from one person to the next is, so if we pretend this is somebody else and they're about to hit send, as soon as they hit send, Trevor is going to receive an email notification and an inbox notification reminding him that he needs to complete this task. He will continue to get those tasks reminders until that is complete. I'm going to hit plan initiated, and it's going to take me to the next step of the process, where at this point I'm adding a validation plan. So I could choose a file and actually bring in the plan that I've developed specifically for this validation process. You also have the ability to add supporting documentation here as well. As I scroll down, we would be adding comments throughout this process, including review comments. And so in this case, here's the plan for the person that needs to review it, that's focusing on this type of testing, and we would send validation plan for approval. Oops, and you'll see that I did not attach my document. When you can see that you get an error here, it's because I had a required field up here. I clicked the validation plan, but I did not hit upload. And so the system caught that, and by catching it, it makes sure that the next person in line has the information they need to move forward. Then it goes to plan approval, where a lot of times QA will review that plan, make sure that it sounds about right, and then continue to move on through these steps. As you can see, every step has an escalation process in between where people are going to be notified. When I get all the way down to the completion of the validation, you'll notice that there's a couple of arrows going in different directions. It's because there could be different outcomes. Once the validation has been complete, whoever's reviewing it might decide that more testing is needed, or that the original plan wasn't sufficient enough, and so we should go back to the original plan and try it again. By doing that, you have buttons that you can push that will direct people to the needed areas that they need to go to perform different tasks. And so the system's going to automatically track all of these steps. It's going to completely create that audit trail that's capturing this information as well. Eventually, once it's submitted to QA, it's going to be reviewed and approved, and then that validation is closed. Why do you want this? Why is this something that could be important to your labs? For the laboratories that are using this to date, when the auditor comes in and the auditor starts asking questions about how your equipment's being validated or how you're keeping those records or how are you proving conformance to the validation steps that you've created for your organization, you can quickly, this is a different way to run reports in our system, run a validation search and be able to pull up a list of all the validations that have happened in your instance, be able to see what piece of equipment they were for, and be able to quickly pull that up in your system to be able to access those records and take that auditor through those different steps of the process. Again, the easier it can be when you're in that audit to pull information quickly and prove conformance, the better. And that's where we see people really start utilizing Qualtrics the most. Now, as I mentioned, we have a couple of best-in-class workflows that will come standard with your system. So these include everything from corrective action requests, internal audits, proficiency testing, risk assessments, validations, vendor approvals, just to name a few of them. There are more. Really one of the features that sets Qualtrics apart for our customers is the ability to configure configure Qualtrics themselves. And with Qualtrics, you have the ability to configure our best-in-class workflows, or even create your own from scratch using our workflow designer. Both options at no extra cost. Being ISO ourselves, we understand the necessity for quality managers and teams to make adjustments to their systems. And so we're going to give you the training and the know-how to be able to do things like that as an end user of our system. So with Qualtrics, let me go back to my presentation. I've got one more thing and then I'll be handing it over to Tim. Workflows is really just one aspect of the Qualtrics system. We present ourselves as an all-in-one quality management solution. And so this includes our document management platform as well as our testing and training tools to help reduce time burden that comes with administrating or grading or even record keeping of competency testing. All three of these sit on top of a reportable tool that makes everything searchable and reportable, which is really helpful for your audits and your pre-audit work in terms of what the times you're saving with your audit prep. All-in-one also refers our business to our business model. We don't sell our software and modules. We don't show you a souped-up version of the product that includes features or functions at extra costs. At Qualtrics, we believe in being honest and transparent. What you see is what you're going to get. So the finer feature I'll mention is often overlooked when you're evaluating products and is our customer service. When you're in the mindset of looking for a product to fit your needs and stay within your budget, you often aren't thinking about what happens once the product is in place or what kind of service and support you're going to get from a vendor. We pride ourselves in going above and beyond for our customers, whether it's during the training or implementation phase of the onboarding process, or even helping you with our customer service and support teams when you're up and running. All of those teams are located here in Blacksburg, Virginia, and we actually have a 98% customer satisfaction rate. It's one of our most common comments we receive on review sites like Capterra, and we believe it's one of our greatest strengths as an organization. So at this time, we would have gone into to Q&A, but at this time, Tim, are you back up and running?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you wonderfully. Let me stop sharing. Thank you, everybody, so much for your patience. And Tim, thank you for letting me go first. I've stopped sharing.
Problem.
Take over.
All right, and I have the controls now.
Yes, you have to hit share screen.
Yep, I did. Everybody
all right,
see?
It's coming up. We see it. Wonderful.
Yay. All right, perseverance paid off. All
yes.
right, well, welcome. Welcome back, everybody, and I do apologize for the glitch there, but I do appreciate your patience. So we're going to continue on the Nonconformance series module here. We're going to focus primarily on equipment records and calibration requirements. And so there will be other webinars coming out on these Nonconformance series where HLA has reviewed all the nonconformances from the assessments that we've performed to ISO IEC 17025-2017. And what we will do is provide you the top 10 over the course of the years and let you know how to apply those, what the assessors are looking for, and so on and so forth. So with that, let's get started into the webinar. And hopefully I can move pages there. There we go. All right, so with the agenda, we're going to focus, like I said, primarily on section 6.4 of 17025. We're going to, one, define what equipment is, because in the training classes and questions I get from the consulting activities, people still struggle with what equipment is. And so we'll cover that. We'll discuss the importance that equipment really does play in the results that you provide to your customers. We'll present and explain the requirements of the standard. We'll also discuss the areas of nonconformance that the assessors have provided to us. And then, like Karen pointed out, we'll present some processes and techniques to help manage the risk so that you yourself, when you apply what we're talking about today, you won't run the risk of getting a nonconformance, which is probably on a lot of people's to-do lists. So what we're going to talk about is, what is a valid result? Well, in order for us to really determine what a valid result is, we need to understand what a process tolerance is. And a process tolerance is basically the methods by which you're performing measurements. So if you're using an ASTM, or you're using an SAE or IEEE or other method, these define your operating parameters by which you're performing a measurement. Included in this are your customers helping you to define what things are permissible when you provide a report or result to them. So in this, as you go through this, you have to consider the personnel competencies that are required, which is Section 6.2 of the standard, facilities and environment, and equipment. And so we're going to focus primarily on how equipment feeds into your process tolerances and why equipment is so important to make sure that you have good controls on it so that it does not impact adversely the results that you want to provide to your customer. The bottom line, as Karen pointed out in her best-in-class workflows, is that our ultimate goal is to make sure whatever we provide to our customer, it's fit for their purpose. And so when we look at our equipment, we want to make sure that our equipment functions to meet our purposes internally before we provide results to our customers. So that's what the validation component of this is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in future slides. So what is equipment? Well, the standard says in clause 6.4.1 that you have to have equipment that provides correct performance in the laboratory activities. The bottom line in 17025 is making sure that you provide, that you have competent people, that you're providing results impartially, but equally as important is that you have consistent results. So part of that, when you look at the equipment definition in 641, these include things like measurement instruments, measurement standards. And what is most often missed, and we'll hit on this as part of the nonconformances, are auxiliary apparatus, things that might not have an asset code, number to them, or a barcode or something else that's applied to them, but does actually impact the measurements that you're making. The other one that we'll talk about more on is software and firmware and making sure that's updated, or if updating is actually appropriate or not. Looking at reference materials, reference data. Oftentimes customers might send reference data, or your vendors will provide reference data that has to be incorporated in software in order for you to get accurate results. I've seen some opportunities for improvement labs there, as well as consumables. A lot of people think the pH solutions and things like that cannot be tracked, but and we've seen that in a lot of assessments, but I beg to differ on their approach on that, as well as reagents. Now, why is equipment management so critical? And I think what we need to really observe here is, do what we do affect the results we're providing to our customer, internally or externally? So the competent person would be able to articulate or derive what the impact might be, either positively or negatively, and make the necessary changes to the system to improve or correct it. So managing our resources is imperative, which is why people came first to 17025, and then, to the personnel, and then the facility, and then subsequently the equipment. So we ask ourselves, why do we want to manage our equipment or even have a calibration program that's required by 6.4.7? Well, first and foremost, it has an impact on your testing and calibration activities. It also supports method validation, and if you're pursuing accreditation, obviously, then accreditation is important. But first and foremost, it's most important that you have customer confidence, which is why we're talking about this today. So in this webinar, when it comes to equipment as defined in 6.4.1, it's important to know that if the equipment we use affects the accuracy or the error and the precision or uncertainty of the results we're providing, because ultimately it affects the customer's confidence, which we're serving or trying to provide. So today we're going to focus on the corrections to the measurement management system, and that may be a new term to you, but at one of the last slides we'll talk about an ISO standard that refers to measurement management systems. How 17025 plays a role in that, how the calibration program assists in this, and then in the following slides we're going to talk primarily about the top 5 nonconformances within section 6.4 of the standard. And what I failed to do in this, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, is where equipment falls in as far as percentages of nonconformances resides. So in this slide, what we have here is I've just taken an excerpt of all of the section 6.4 nonconformances that we have, and you look at that number and you probably sit hard in your seat on that. It's 1,278 nonconformances. Well, in the scheme of things, this is only 38% of the nonconformances, which is significant. So this makes this our number one area that we want to focus in on. As you can see, the section in the pie graph before you, you can see how this is broken down. So in section 6.4.13, we talk about records. In 6.4.6, we talk about measurement accuracy and measurement uncertainty. 6.4.8, we focus on identity of the equipment and labeling, and we'll go over each of these sections as we go through that. But what's important to note is, and I've grouped it here, so it's important for you to note carefully that a lot of these sections, specifically 6 sections within 6.4, tie in with other sections within itself, namely 6.4.5 with respect to calibration and requiring you to have calibration, and 6.4.6, which says if you're going to have something calibrated, make sure that it's accurate and uncertain, and the uncertainties are small enough that it doesn't impact your measurements. That's one grouping. The second grouping is clause 6.4.4, which focuses on verification of equipment, but clause 6.4.13c says you have to show us records of that verification, but it doesn't tell you how to do it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The third grouping is clause 6.4.8, which talks about identity and labeling of equipment, but then 6.4 and the calibration status, and then 6.4.13a talks about the equipment itself. So we have a lot to cover, and it may not seem like 5 nonconformances because we've got these other clauses tying into one another, but because they do, that's how we've grouped this presentation together. So without further ado, let's move right into the first grouping. So the first clause, 6.4.5, says equipment that's used for measurement shall be capable of achieving the accuracy and/or measurement uncertainty that is required to provide a valid result. And if you remember from that previous slide, I gave an illustration of what accuracy and uncertainty is. If you have questions about that, we can discuss that later on in another slide. But the point here is making sure that you have your eyes set on accuracy and uncertainty, which is a little bit different from what we had in the 2005 version of the standard. Section 6.4.6, which I said piggyback together with this clause, says that measuring equipment shall be calibrated when A, the measurement accuracy or the measurement uncertainty affects the validity of the reported results, which ties in wonderfully with what Karen brought up earlier, and the calibration of the equipment is required to establish metrological traceability of the reported results. So there have been nonconformances cited around this metrological traceability. This report does not include those that are cited to A2LA's policy on traceability, the P102 document, but only those that were cited against this particular clause. So there are a lot more tied around with traceability that are not included in this assessment here. But the one thing I do want to make sure that you're aware of is that if you're not required to establish metrological traceability in that measurement for that particular device, then does it need to be calibrated? And that's the critical question that you need to take into consideration. And that will tie in very nicely when we talk about verification of equipment in section 771 a little bit later. So 6.4.5, so what have we observed as assessors? How have laboratories evaluated its ability to achieve the accuracy and uncertainty in the calibration? So what are we seeing? First and foremost, most of the time, we're not seeing that calibrations are being performed across the entire range of the unit where it's being used. They calibrate it, for example, up to 3 keV when it's being used up to 15 keV, or other units of measurement, or they're not, as you see in the illustration here of the spectrum, this optical emission spectroscopy output, they don't calibrate all the points. They calibrate it at 550 nanometer wavelength or something like that. The other point is we see that people are calibrating things at single point, thinking that if they calibrate it there, it's good across the range. Well, if you look at the graph that's got the hysteresis diagram on the lower right-hand side, this is a forest diagram that you would see, and extension based on extensometer and displacement for mechanical deformation. If that point doesn't happen to lie on that hysteresis graph somewhere, you can see that you're introducing a significant amount of error in your measurements. So this is why we're seeing a lot of this. And a lot of people think, well, it's cheaper to get a single point, but is it really cheaper in the long run for getting a single point? And as I pointed out earlier, it's being used outside of ranges, one of the other things I see quite frequently is that equipment is reconfigured after a calibration. That means readjusting gain settings, changing dip switches, and all kinds of things like that, which, if it's not calibrated in that way and it affects the discrimination values that you're observing, then that impacts your measurements, and we're not evaluating, perhaps, the effect of those switches or gain adjustments on your system. And then the other thing that I see a lot of is that when people review the reports, they're not looking at the uncertainties. They say, yep, I got a calibration certificate by XYZ, it's accredited by ABC, and the uncertainties are a lot larger than their process tolerances. And there were a significant, I would say, of the 4.5 nonconformances probably ran into about 10% of those. So please keep in mind that you have to be aware of the impact of the error or accuracy as well as the measurement uncertainty. And in 6.4.6, we also discovered that a lot of people aren't calibrating things. And remember, if we go back to what the standard says, if it impacts your measurement accuracy or your uncertainty in the process that you're doing, then it has to be calibrated, or if you're trying to establish metrological traceability. A lot of other times we're finding things that are past due or expired calibrations. And for people that have systems, we discovered that many people were swapping out equipment in systems as calibrated as systems. And if you don't understand the way it performs in the system by swapping that out, now you've just broken the calibration of that system. And a lot of times they don't necessarily swap out equipment that has the same level of accuracy and uncertainty as the piece that was removed and replaced with. Again, you're affecting your calibration, and you could be, as in the last bullet point, your metrological traceability. So, looking at the requirements of 6.4.4, the next nonconformance. The laboratory shall verify that its equipment conforms to specified requirements before being placed into service. As I mentioned in the previous comment, there is no requirement in the standard for what verification is. It gives you the lateral to go in and determine what that is based upon the risk you're willing to take by the rigor that you put into this. 6.4.13c is where the record is required of that, and as you saw from Karen's walkthrough in her Qualtrics platform, there is a nice place to store all of those records to demonstrate conformance with specified requirements. And what's really nice is that you can define those requirements right there in that software. So what is it we're observing? Well, more times than not, we're finding out that laboratories that do have LIMS systems or QMS equipment records, they're not updated. People will get the certificate, they'll file them, and that'll be the end of the story. The other thing that we also observed is that sometimes you can put those verifications within the electronics themselves. Sometimes those checks, like in the electronics world, they have auto cals, they have zero cals, and all those kinds of things. Those kinds of things, some equipment has software that will actually track that information in there. Some assessors don't know that, and that's another issue that the accrediting bodies have to manage. But if that has the capability, there's no reason on earth why you can't store it there. People are misfiling them in networks, and then yes, people are not filing them in the places that they need to go, and yes, people are still logging things with paper, especially the single-person laboratories. They don't have the luxury of investing in a quality management system software. So let's discuss what this looks like. Karen illustrated nicely what Qualtrics can do for you, and it does a very nice job, so much so that A2L even bought the product. So there's a shot in the arm for that. But what does this verification look like? I mentioned to you earlier the standard doesn't necessarily specify in 6.4 what it does, but if you go to section 771, which talks about ensuring the validity of results, which goes back to one of my opening slide comments about process validation or verification, this is really important. All the stuff about reviewing reports, as simple as that is, that's something that everybody does when they get it in, or hopefully they do. This can be documented in your system, however you do that. It could be a check plus smiley face on a report that's filed in a piece of paper in a filing cabinet, or it could be, as Karen illustrated, as rigorous as login credentialing to be able to authorize a review of a report based on competencies spelled out in section 625 of the standard, or something like that. And you can also perform functional checks, intermediate checks, reference and quality and control materials, etc. So the list that goes on. Next, we're going to talk about the requirements of labeling and identification. 6.4.8 says all equipment requiring calibration has to be labeled and identified. And this labeling and identification says somehow what the status is of that, whether it's been calibrated, if it's undergone a maintenance plan, and all this other kind of stuff that could be with it. What it doesn't tell you in the standard is how you do that. And there are multiple ways that you can accomplish this fairly easily. But what you have to consider when you're doing this is, in some cases, where you're using fixtures and things like that that don't allow readily easy identification, you have to consider a couple of things. And the first here is the environment that the equipment will be in. I've seen a lot of labs when you go to steel mills, or you're dealing with places that are dealing with very oily environments or extreme conditions as identified here, tags don't have a tendency of staying on. If there are heavily used items, they don't stay on. Even when you have metal tags wired harnessed to them, they find themselves without tags. So what is it you can do? Well, you have to be creative in this area, and you don't have to necessarily have a tag on everything. You may have something engraved in or etched in glass or something like that that tells you how to trace this back to a database somewhere, or an equipment file in a network or in a paper file. The standard says it has to be readily identifiable, but readily is completely up to you. You can't let the assessors drive you to say, well, readily means from the time I'm sitting here at the audit. Okay, it's completely up to you in driving that. Now, if it's significantly important, then using risk-based thinking, you want to make sure that you have that right there next to the equipment that's being used. And as I mentioned before, you can ID at any different way that you can imagine. You can have a localized status board. I went to an aerospace facility that was machining turbine blading, and they had a status board with all the different IDs on it, with the calibration due dates and the maintenance due on them, on a board that wasn't attached specifically to the assets, but was traceable by an ID on the asset. You can use metal tags, asset tags, RFIDs. The sky's the limit on what you can do here. Now, the records retention is another issue that we need to talk about. You need to identify what that equipment is, and we see most of the nonconformances around them not identifying it, including things like consumables, pH, conductivity, electrical conductivity standards that might be used for NDT, All of these things in corrosive environments or things like that, somehow or other you have to do that, whether it be using a serial number, an asset number, barcodes, QR codes, RFIDs, unique markings. Unique markings are really intriguing because I guarantee the majority of you that are on this call have masses in your laboratories. And sometimes they might just have 1, 2, or 3 dots that are located on there and a serial number tied to a box. Well, typically you don't have a label on a mass because then it renders the mass unusable. So you have to find a creative way to managing the data and the identity of that asset. Next is, we're going to look at the software and firmware version. Now, of all of the individual clauses in the standard, this is the one that had the highest number of hits, the software and firmware version. This is a new addition to the standard. Now, for this clause to find value to the laboratory, you need to be aware of the impact of the software and firmware versions on the measurement results as it's providing it to your customers. I'm sure everyone on this webinar can relate to the software updates to iPhones and Microsoft products, right? And the usual response is, well, you know what, maybe we'll wait until the even number releases come out because they'll fix all the odd releases that are being beta tested by everybody else. Or I'll wait until my friends tell me about how good it is or bad it is before I perform the updates. Well, the latest on the iPhone is in the email update where, I was working on trying to email somebody, and now this cancel button overrides the text that you're trying to compose on it. Well, I get really frustrated about that, and I've canceled a lot of long emails on my phone because of this new update. Well, these kinds of things are very frustrating. But the thing is that it's very important, especially when you're making measurements in GCs and MSs and all these things like that, where software updates are being updated through internet connections and things like that. What does that impact look like? So the due diligence on your end is making sure that if they make those updates, how's that going to change your measurement results? And if you're control charting that and all of a sudden you see shifts in your control chart, is it because they came in and when they did the maintenance on it, they put in new firmware? Did they upgrade the software? What is that? And you can go down a huge rabbit hole of doing investigation to try and figure out what that cause is. So knowing that information up front, or at least knowing at it as it's being done, knowing about it as it's being done is extremely important, okay? Because it can have a deleterious effect on you. So what are some of these advantages or disadvantages you gain by these updates? Well, you have to ask yourself, how does the firmware or software impact your measurement accuracy and certainty? This gets back to the previous slide that we talked about. The second might be, will it impact the trend data and uncertainties, which I was talking about in the control charting, that will adversely affect our customers and our customer expectations? And what risks am I putting my customers at by updating the software? I've run into cases in my previous job where they wanted to push an update of software into my system, but the system was built around an old version of a standard. And so had I done that, I would have rendered all the subsequent results to my customers wrong, the bottom line is. So you have to know what's going on with it is the bottom line that I want to get you guys to pay attention to. So how do we do this? Well, we can manage this through software platforms like Qualtrics, your own databases or networks. I've seen other laboratory information management systems that manage this. I've seen it and I've done it in spreadsheets and workbooks, filing cabinets, electronic equipment. In some cases, you can identify the software and firmware versions in boot sequences, which is extremely important. In some cases, for a lot of the in the life sciences field, that information is provided on reports that come out, which is very handy. Electromechanical devices have flash memory, and then other devices have what we call TEDs, which are the transducer electronic data sheets, which is flash memory embedded on hardware that is used for measurements that are plugged in to a laptop or a computer that will incorporate all of the information that's in that data onto a calibration report or make it available for measurement uncertainty calculations later on. The next is the requirements for maintenance plans and maintenance carried out to date. This was another significant hitter. Many lab supervisors that I've managed or audited or assessed view maintenance as an afterthought in many cases. Some people with tire rotations, oil or other fluid changes, and belt replacements. We'll fix it when it breaks is what a lot of the small companies will do. For me, because I tend to be conservative, if I hear a strange noise or I get close to a maintenance limit, I'm right there in the shop. I don't want anything going wrong, especially on the DC Beltway. It's not a convenient place to have a breakdown. But there is an adage I want to share with you, and then we'll get back into the meat. It says, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If I maintain my equipment at the front end, the likelihood of damage and a loss of work production there will be in the future. So here's a story from an assessment I was on. I visited a Cal lab which performed a lot of precision electrical calibration work. And the shop wasn't OCD clean, but it was organized. There was a lot of equipment stacked one on top of the other. And when I looked at the back of the instruments where the cooling fan intake was, the pre-filters were clogged. Now mind you, this is a maintenance item the manufacturing highlights because a hot instrument gives false readings. So I asked the technician to determine if the instrument temperature was an issue and how it was part of the electronic device and if the temperature was out of tolerance. Sure enough, when he looked at the information that was logged on the electronic device, it was out of tolerance. So he was making bad measurements. And had I not brought that up, it could have caused failures for our customers. Either, it was failing and is now passing, or it was passing and should be failing. So the moral of the story is that we need to make sure that we understand how the maintenance impacts the measurement accuracy and the measurement uncertainty of the measurements that we are making. So where can we find this? And this is kind of old data that we've already talked about, and Karen's illustrated. Any of these opportunities you can take a look at. One of the things that I like about control charts and SPC data is that for the very critical measurements, most laboratories are doing this, you will see shifts because of the lack of maintenance that's being done or things that have not been verified and so on and so forth. So that's another way that you can capture this. So we're getting close to the end of the webinar, but I'm going to summarize a couple of things for you. The bottom line here is that equipment management does affect your ability to satisfy your customers. And as you can see by the number of non-conformances, the assessors and you, more importantly, should be focused on making sure that your equipment and the assets are being utilized to the most that they possibly can, and you're getting the most out of them. And if you're a business manager, that's extremely important. So take a look at those measurement results when you get them. Look at the uncertainties and the accuracies. If you've got errors and correction factors, make sure they're used and they're updated appropriately. If they are making statements of conformance, these things affect your ability to make decision risks and decision rules, which are not covered in today's session. But by managing your equipment says to your technicians, your internal customers, that yes, we're making good measurements, and they have confidence. They feel that they can go out and make measurements and not feel like they're compromising their customers. And then ultimately, you get great customer confidence in your product. So managing measurement risk is not only a back-end product. Let's wait until it breaks and then we'll fix it. It's actually very front-end management. So you need to look at the method and the procedure requirements and tolerances to make sure that your process actually will meet your customers' needs, and that the equipment that you're using, the specifications, its accuracies, its precision, all meet the needs of your methods that you're providing to your customers, and that you have good vendor communication if you have to outsource any of that kind of stuff. And last but not least is make sure you've got a good calibration program. It shall be reviewed and adjusted as necessary. That doesn't mean that's only the calibration intervals. It means, do I change the intermediate checks? Do I move from intermediate checks to, we're really got a stable environment. I'm going to just look at reports, or I'm just going to do functional checks. You're responsible not only for equipment, but you're also responsible for the expenses that you're driving in your organization. So the cost versus benefit balance, or risk management, more correctly called, has to be taken into consideration. And last, I mentioned at the opening part of the slide deck was there is a standard out there for measurement management systems. It's an ISO 10012. It was I wouldn't say recently reaffirmed. It was reaffirmed 5 years ago. I'm already projecting into 2020, but this is a really good resource to help you manage the process of a calibration program. And if you've never looked at it, I would encourage you to go out and get this document. It's very helpful for that. And with that, this is, I've ended my part of the presentation, and now what I'd like to do is I'm going to turn this back over and to Karen and her team, and we'll open up the floor for questions.
All right. Can you hear me, Tim?
I can.
All right. And because I want to share my screen one last time, here is our questions screen. We have a lot of questions that are coming in, so we're going to do our best to get through them. Because we had a little bit of delay, we'll go a little bit past the 3 o'clock mark. But if we're not able to get to your questions, don't worry, we'll be in touch. We'll reach out right after this webinar to make sure that we get those answered for you. Tim, I actually was wondering if you could answer a question for me. Can you tell me a little bit about A2LA workplace training and kind of like the services that you guys provide through that organization?
Sure. So we provide training through e-learning and what we call instructor-led training, both in the public forum, but we also provide contract training to our customers for those that want more hands-on with their processes. And then we also provide consulting, which I'm leaning more towards the coaching, because we develop a coach, sports person relationship with the people that we do. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's start diving into some of these questions. And I know we've got a number of them. One of them is a question we get very often. Is your software supplemental to LIMS, or can it serve to replace it? Is it a supplemental, or what makes Qualtrics different from a LIMS with audit trails and similar features? We get this question all the time. We have hundreds of laboratories that use Qualtrics today. All of them have a LIMS system, all of them have Qualtrics. And so they work hand in hand together. And so what's happening there, your LIMS system is what you're doing your sample tracking with. What Qualtrics is really focused on is the quality element. We stem from quality, we stem from ISO. And so what the software has been developed to do is to truly automate and help you show conformance to the SOPs and the standards that you are performing against. With Qualtrics, it really comes down, and what we've seen and we've heard from our customers and just being out in the field is that when you look at your LIMS system, though they might have areas for document management and some of the forms to fill out for some of the processes that we automate, the big difference is the automation. The idea that you have a system that's continually reminding you when something is due, the idea that you have the visibility into your data. One of the things that Tim talked about right towards the end of his presentation was risk. Risk is one of the hot topics we talk about here at Qualtrics, because like Tim mentioned, it's all about not just acting on a risk that might happen, that might show up after it's happened, but it's also making sure you're proactive as an organization. How do you identify risks before they've even occurred? Well, having visibility into your quality system that you're collecting through your corrective action requests and your internal auditing and all the information you're gathering in our system and being able to report on it is going to be what you're able to really drill into and look at. I honestly think we could do a whole nother webinar and the differences between LIMS versus Qualtrics. But hopefully, we can jump on a phone call and I can really drive through exactly some of those differences for you, depending on what LIMS systems you're working with. Automation is the key there. All right. Here's another question quick about Qualtrics. Is the software validated? Yes, every time we have a new release, we actually have a very active release schedule. We do about 3 or 4 new releases per year. We are validating our software in-house prior to releasing it. We also have organizations that need to do more in-depth validation processes. So whether if you're under FDA or even EU GMP, or if you need IQ, OQ, PQ type validation processes, we do have a validation package that you're able to use to make sure that you're meeting that for your organization. And does our software have an audit trail? Absolutely. I think when you start really diving into the software, we can show you the audit trail for every action that happens within the system. For example, with the workflows, it's right there with every instance of a workflow that in record that is created. With our documents, we're tracking the full life cycle of the documents in terms of the full edit, approval, and review process, as well as with our testing and training too, and making sure you have a record of who's doing what and when. So absolutely, that would be something that for anybody on the call, if you ever want to take a deeper dive into our services here at Qualtrics, or even the services that A2LA and Workplace Training offer, please let us know. We'd be happy to put you in touch with appropriate individuals to get more information about both options. Is the email notification option something that can be added to any workflow? And I would really like to work with somebody on this. Absolutely. Emails are the key to the system and being notified with Qualtrics. It works with every task that is created in our system, and you can either use emails that are standard in our system or create your own. Usually the emails that are sent out, again, are on that escalation process where then you can see what's being done. If you're late or if you need to let managers know that you haven't done something, they'll be notified as well. And Tim, I saw a question. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. This one's for you, Tim. How far should we go with collecting firmware information for equipment? What all will be included in the LCMSMS equipment setup firmware list?
That's a really good question. So basically, for firmware, the only firmware that I would be concerned with is typically, what was replaced. In some cases, it'll identify a specific board with certain functions. And that's probably what I would do, is just track that, so that how that affects the accuracy and uncertainty of your measurements. Because if it doesn't do that, then I wouldn't worry so much about that. Some of that stuff is just gaining efficiencies in data transfers and things like that really don't necessarily impact you. I would only worry or focus my attention on those areas. And if an assessor were to ask, then I would say this particular upgrade didn't impact that, and so we're not tracking it, in the detail that you would otherwise. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great. All right, and here's another question. And Tim, you tell me, and with the nonconformances that A2LA was tracking, was one of the top ones that we'll talk about moving forward with some of these webinars around risk and risk analysis?
Actually, yeah. So primarily where that lies was in the management review in section 8.9 and 8.9.2. There weren't many as people were getting educated. The section 8.5, I think the concerns people were having were dissipated, and we're actually putting the nonconformances more correctly in section 8.9 with respect to how do management reviews manage and address risks and opportunities in subsection O, and both in the input and the output of the management review. So that'll be talked about later.
Great. And we actually have a risk assessment workflow that a lot of our customers are using to date that helps them actually log those risks and control them and make sure that they're being monitored on a regular basis, that we would show in conjunction with that. Another question, we're getting a lot of questions here about pricing structure for Qualtrics. The way that Qualtrics works, it's a license-based product. It's a subscription per year. And so what we would look at is how your use of Qualtrics, how you're going to be using it, and how many people would need access to the system. So if anybody has questions specifically of what it would cost for their organization, let us know, and we'd be happy to talk with you about that further. Is the software customizable? 100%. In fact, I saw some people ask questions around customizing options, or can you link workflows together? 100%. I go back to, we're ISO 2, we're under ISO. So we understand that you have to have it be configurable so you can best fit your organization. Anybody that comes to you that says it's a one-fits-all size approach, it's not going to be the most user friendly for your type of organization and what you need to do to show conformance to the standard. So ours is very configurable, whether you're adjusting our best-in-class workflows and adding a field. So I saw a question about, can you add a field when you're logging information about specific equipment? Absolutely. You can completely rework those workflows if you want, or use them as is, or you can build your own. From the configurability, we have some organizations that have really taken Qualtrics to the next level. We have some laboratories that, I kid you not, have 70 workflows in their system, and they're using it from everything from corrective actions and internal audits all the way to equipment logs and laboratory logs. Or we've even seen some for reimbursement requests or trip requests. I mean, there's a lot that you can do in the system. Those logs that you can do, like for your humidity logs or your QC logs that you're tracking in our system, will also help you in showing conformance to the processes that you create. So in terms of configurability, that's usually like the biggest reason why people will come and start using Qualtrics, is because you have that capability. Um, Tim, here's another question for you. Is A2LA observing many deficiencies related to the scope of accreditation being inappropriate for calibration work obtained from external accredited labs?
I don't know what many means, but enough to be recognized. And I did note that that there are people out there that have scopes of accreditation that say they can do one thing, and they kind of stretch. I wouldn't say stretch the truth. They probably believe that something is covered under the scope that really isn't from those external labs. That's a good discussion that should be had with with your third-party provider, is making sure that those things are covered. And so, for those of you that aren't familiar with calibration scopes, typically in the comment section, it defines the methodology based upon the equipment. And many times the customers don't quite understand what that means. And you need to make sure that you have that discussion with them that, oh, well, we actually use this other kind of equipment to make that measurement for you. Then you have to ask the question, is that really covered under their scope, and ferret that out. But most of the time, I would say that there's enough to make a good comment that the question that you have there, but I wouldn't say it's a systemic problem across the board. Most calibration service providers tend to do a pretty decent job at publishing on their scopes and keeping within their scope of capability.
Great, great. And we're gonna talk about two more additional questions, and then if we didn't get to your question, we'll make sure to reach out to you once this is over and make sure we get those answered. The next question: does Qualtrics cover the QMS for ISO 9001 non-labs such as manufacturing, supplier control, and approval? Absolutely. Supplier control and vendor approvals are actually best-in-class workflows that you have for us. In terms of Qualtrics and the different standards that you can be under and use Qualtrics, Qualtrics is really, you can bring any type of standard you want to in. In fact, that's one of the things that we see our users do. We have organizations under 9001, 17025, 020, 15189 if you're a clinical organization, TNI if you're environmental, NAME, ABFT if you're more on the forensic medical examiner side, and toxicology. At the end of the day, it's our system accepts any type of standard. When you purchase a system, we'll understand from you exactly what type of standard you are adhering to. We'll bring it into Qualtrics, where you can then assign different documents and workflow processes to it, and even run gap analysis reports. Again, if you want to really see that in more of a specific instance for your organization, let us know. We'd be happy to show you a demonstration for that. We even have some cannabis laboratories that are starting to use the product now that have different locations, and depending on what state they're in, they have different standards. You know, TNI if you're in Oregon, or if you're in California, you're under ISO 17025, and then you can even have the BCC requirements in the system. So you absolutely can bring anything in there, and we do help cover the supplier control and vendor approval. We'd be happy to walk you through that workflow, or anybody else who's interested in seeing it. And here's one more for you, Tim. A piece of equipment that goes into field has a QR code that links directly to A2LA marked Cal certificate. Is that okay, or does it violate any type of 17025 NDA type requirement or labeling because anyone can see the cert?
That's a really good question. So what we're talking about is the confidentiality here, is how the standard puts it. If the calibration service provider has that information available and is not afraid to share it, then it should not be an issue. I mean, for one, it's advertising for the calibration service provider. If somebody else goes in and does the code, but I think, to keep things professional, I would say, hey, calibration service provider, we're looking to do this. Anybody's walking through my space can scan it. Is that going to be a problem? And at least have that discussion with them. I would say probably more times no than yes. So, meaning that they won't have a problem with you doing that. But if you go back to facilities and environment controls, if that, you said it was in the field, so I don't know that it would be an issue. But I would, like I said, go back and talk with the service provider to make sure that wouldn't be an issue. But it could be with their competitors if their competitors are going through that same space. So that's a really good question.
All right. And I know we have some more questions out there, but we're going to end the webinar. Everyone else, if you did not get your question answered, we'll make sure to reach out to you and get those questions. For any questions even past this webinar, once we close it, feel free to reach out to us at webinar@qualtrics.com, or you can even reach me at Karen@qualtrics.com, and I'd be happy to get you pointed in the right direction to get your questions answered, whether that's from us, from Qualtrics, or even workplace training. Tim, thank you so very much for your time today and sharing all this wonderful information with us. And we really are looking forward to this series and more of what we can provide on an educational stance for ISO IEC 17025. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Wonderful. All right, everybody, you guys have a great Friday, and we'll be in contact soon. Thank you so very much. Bye-bye.